glass vase shattered against the mahogany door just inches from my head, spraying shards of expensive crystal across my worn shoes. I didn't flinch. I had seen this storm coming since the day my son, Julian, brought Clara Vance home. Clara wasn't just rich, she was old money rich, the kind of wealth that thinks it can buy the sun and the moon. She stood in the center of their sprawling penthouse, her face twisted in a mask of beautiful, cold fury. "I told you, Witney," she hissed, her voice trembling with the kind of jealousy that only comes from someone who has everything but owns nothing. "This is my home. Julian is my husband. Your motherly visits are no longer part of the budget." I looked past her to my son, Julian. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city he now helped rule, but his shoulders were slumped. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my house, yet he looked like a prisoner. "Clara, please," he whispered, not even brave enough to look me in the eye. "She just came to bring the soup you liked." Clara laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the air. She walked over to him and adjusted his silk tie, her fingers lingering around his throat like a gilded noose. "We have a private chef for soup, darling. What we don't have room for is the smell of poverty in our living room." I had raised Julian alone. I was an orphan myself, a girl named Witney who had grown up in drafty hallways with nothing but a library card and a dream for her son. I had scrubbed floors and worked 3 jobs to put him through the best schools. I thought I was building his future, but I realized now I had only been building a bridge for a predator like Clara to cross. She saw Julian's brilliance and his kind heart, and she decided she wanted to own it. Not love it, own it. Clara turned back to me, her eyes scanning my faded coat with disgust. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a checkbook. With a flick of her wrist, she scribbled a number that would have changed my life 10 years ago. She tore the paper off and let it flutter to the floor. "There, consider this a severance package for your services as a mother. Take it, leave, and don't call him again. If you do, I'll make sure the loan on your small bakery is called in by the bank tomorrow morning. My father owns that bank, Witney. Don't test the power of my signature." I looked at the check on the floor, then at my son. Julian stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was choosing the gold over the blood. My heart didn't break, it turned into stone. I realized then that Clara wasn't just trying to move me out. She was trying to erase me. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange vibration in my pocket, my phone. It was a text from an old contact I hadn't spoken to in decades. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on Clara's smug smile. But as I read the message on my screen, I realized that the Vance family didn't own everything after all. The elevator descended in a sickeningly smooth drop, matching the plummeting feeling in my chest. I looked at my phone again. The message was from a man named Silas, a lawyer who had handled the estate of the orphanage where I grew up. It read, "Witney, The seal has been broken. The trust your biological mother left behind is active. You need to come to the office immediately. You are no longer the woman you think you are. I gripped the railing of the elevator. All my life, I believed I was a nobody, a discarded child with no history. I had used that humbleness to raise Julian, teaching him that character mattered more than cash. But as I walked out into the cold rain of the city, I realized Clara had taught him a different lesson. She had taught him that money was a god, and he was a faithful worshiper. I drove my old car back to the small bakery I owned, the one Clara had threatened to destroy. My hands were shaking. If Clara's father owned the bank, he could wipe out my livelihood with a single phone call. She was jealous of the bond I had with Julian, a bond built on 20 years of shared struggles, and she was using her wealth like a scalpel to cut it away. When I arrived at the bakery, the closed sign was already hanging on the door. My head baker, a kind woman named Sarah, was standing out front with tears in her eyes. "Witney, I don't know what happened," she sobbed. "Two men in suits came by 10 minutes ago. They slapped a foreclosure notice on the door. They said the property has been seized due to an irregularity in the deed. We have until midnight to vacate." My blood ran cold. Clara hadn't even waited for me to get home. She wanted to show me her power instantly. She wanted me homeless and broken so that I would have no choice but to take her severance check and disappear. She thought that by taking my shop, she was taking my spirit. But she didn't know Witney. She didn't know the girl who had survived the streets before Julian was even a thought. I pulled out my phone and dialed Julian's private number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Blocked. My own son had blocked me on the orders of his wife. The jealousy had won. Clara wanted him all to herself, a trophy husband kept in a cage of luxury, and I was the only person who could remind him of who he used to be. I looked at the foreclosure notice, then at the lawyer's text message. I wasn't going to crawl to the bank to beg for mercy. I was going to the lawyer's office to find out exactly how much power I really had. And then I was going to buy the bank. The lawyer's office was located in a building so tall it pierced the clouds, far above the penthouse, where Clara was currently celebrating my downfall. Silas was a man who looked like he was made of parchment and secrets. He didn't offer me coffee or sympathy. He simply pushed a thick leather folder across the desk. "Your mother wasn't a woman who abandoned you because she didn't want you, Witney," Silas said softly. "She was a woman who was running from a family much like the one your son just married into. She hid you to protect you, and she left this." I opened the folder. My eyes blurred as I saw the figures. It wasn't just a trust fund. It was a global empire of land, shipping, and technology that had been compounding for 50 years. The nobody orphan was, in fact, the sole heir to the sterling legacy. I had spent my life counting pennies for flour and sugar while I was sitting on a mountain of gold. But the most important part wasn't the money, it was the list of subsidiaries. Sela's, I said, my voice sounding like cracking ice. Does this legacy include the first national bank of the city? Sela's gave a thin, predatory smile. We don't just own the bank, Witney. We own the land the bank sits on, the company that provides their security, and the debt of the man who claims to be the chairman, Clara's father, Mr. Vance. The irony was so sharp it hurt. Clara was trying to crush me using a hammer that I actually owned. She was so blinded by her jealousy of my influence over Julian that she hadn't bothered to check who I really was. She saw a baker. She didn't see a queen. I stood up, the leather folder tucked under my arm. I didn't feel rich. I felt dangerous. I want the foreclosure on my bakery reversed by sunset, I commanded, and I want a meeting with Mr. Vance. Not as a baker, but as the new majority shareholder. But don't tell him my name yet. I want it to be a surprise. I walked out of the office and headed back to the penthouse. I wasn't there to argue or plead. I wanted to see if Julian had any spark of the boy I raised left in him. I found him in the lobby, carrying a suitcase. Clara was behind him, looking smugger than ever. Back for more, Witney, she sneered. I told you the bakery is gone. Julian and I are leaving for a 3-month cruise. He won't have a phone. He won't have a mother. He'll only have me. Julian looked at me, his face a mask of shame. Mom, just take the money and go. Clara is right. It's better this way. We're moving on. I looked at my son, the boy I'd given everything for, and realized he wasn't being kidnapped. He was a willing participant in his own sale. Moving on, Julian, I asked. Then I suppose you won't mind if I move on too. Starting with your career. My career. Julian laughed, though it sounded forced. Mom, I'm the executive vice president of Vance Holdings. Clara's father is the CEO. My career is unshakable. You're just a baker who lost her shop. Go home. Clara stepped forward, her expensive perfume cloying in the air. She wrapped her arm around Julian's waist, staking her claim. You heard him, Witney. You're a ghost now, a memory. Julian has a new life, a new name, and a new future. We don't need your home-cooked advice. We have everything. I leaned in close to Clara, so close she could see the lack of fear in my eyes. Money is a funny thing, Clara. It can build walls, but it can also be a fire that burns the house down. You think you bought Julian. You didn't. You just rented him. And the lease is about to expire. Clara's face reddened. Security. Get this woman out of here. 2 guards approached, but I didn't wait for them to touch me. I turned and walked out, my heart cold and focused. I had tried to save Julian with love, but he had chosen a different currency. Now, I would have to save him with reality. I drove to the headquarters of Vance Holdings. It was a glass tower that symbolized the power of money. I walked into the lobby, and this time, I didn't head for the reception desk. I headed for the private elevators. Ma'am, you can't go up there. The receptionist yelled. I can go anywhere I want in this building. I said without looking back. I reached the top floor, the executive suite. Mr. Vance was sitting at a desk that looked like it cost more than a suburban house. He was a man who looked like he had never been told no in his life. When he saw me, he didn't even stand up. "You must be Julian's mother. My daughter told me you were." Persistent. "I believe we've already dealt with your little bakery problem. What more do you want? A pension? A bribe?" I threw the leather folder onto his desk. "I want you to look at page 4, Mr. Vance, and then I want you to tell me who owns the debt on your latest acquisition in Dubai." Mr. Vance sneered and opened the folder, expecting to see a plea for help. As he read, his face didn't just turn pale, it turned gray. He looked at the document, then at me, then back at the document. This is impossible. The Sterling Trust has been dormant for 50 years. No one has seen the heir. "You're looking at her," I said, "and I've decided that Vance Holdings is no longer a viable investment. I'm calling in the debt. All of it. By tomorrow morning, this building, your daughter's penthouse, and every cent in your personal accounts will be frozen." Mr. Vance's hand shook as he reached for his phone. I can fix this. Clara, she didn't know. She was just trying to protect her marriage. She was trying to buy my son," I interrupted. "And in doing so, she sold your soul. Tell your daughter to start packing. She's about to find out what it's like to be a nobody." I walked out of the office, the sound of Mr. Vance's frantic phone calls fading behind me. I felt a strange sense of emptiness. Wealth wasn't supposed to feel this cold, but I suppose that's why my mother had hidden it from me. It wasn't a gift, it was a weapon, and I was about to use it to level the world Clara had built. I went back to my bakery. The foreclosure notices were already being peeled off by the same men in suits who had put them up. They didn't look me in the eye as I walked past. Sarah was inside, looking stunned. "Witney, they just called. They said there was a clerical error, and that we own the building outright now." "What did you do?" "I just reminded them who they work for, Sarah," I said, putting on my apron. I needed to work. I needed the smell of bread and the feel of flour to remind me that I was still Witney. I spent the night baking, watching the news on the small TV in the corner. The headlines started hitting at midnight. Vance Holdings faces massive liquidation. Banking mogul's daughter evicted from luxury penthouse. The Sterling heir returns. I saw a grainy video of Clara and Julian standing on the sidewalk, surrounded by suitcases. Clara was screaming at a police officer, her face red and ugly. Julian was just standing there, looking at the ground. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The jealousy that had fueled Clara's fire had finally consumed her. She had tried to isolate Julian from the only person who truly loved him, thinking that money was the ultimate barrier. She didn't realize that by attacking me, she was attacking the very source of the wealth she worshipped. At 3 a.m., there was a knock on the bakery door. I didn't have to look to know who it was. I opened the door to find Julian standing in the rain. He was shivering, his expensive suit soaked and ruined. He looked like the little boy who used to come home after losing a playground fight. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Clara, she's gone." She took the last of the cash and went to her mother, S. She said I was useless to her now. I looked at my son, the man who had stood by while his wife shattered a vase near my head and threw a check at my feet. I wanted to pull him inside and give him a bowl of soup, but I remembered the look in his eyes when he told me to take the money and go. "You're sorry because you're hungry, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "Not because you're wrong. You chose her world, and her world collapsed. If you want to come back into mine, you don't start at the penthouse. You start at the sink." I handed him a scrub brush and pointed to the dirty pans. Julian stared at the scrub brush in his hand like it was an alien object. For the last several months, the only thing he had held was a gold-plated pen and a glass of vintage scotch. He looked at the mountain of greasy pans in the sink, then back at me. "Mom, I'm an executive. I can help you run the Sterling Trust. I can help you manage the bank. I don't belong at a sink." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "You were an executive because of Clara's father. You were a pawn in a game played with stolen money. You want to be part of my life. Then you need to learn the value of $1 that isn't handed to you on a silver platter. Clara didn't just take your soul, Julian. She took your work ethic. Now start scrubbing or find a park bench to sleep on." Julian hesitated, the pride still flickering in his eyes. He looked out at the rainy street, where his remaining suitcases sat on the curb. He had nowhere else to go. Clara had made sure of that. In her jealousy, she had alienated all his old friends, telling them they weren't wealthy enough to associate with him. Now that the money was gone, he was truly alone. He stepped to the sink and began to scrub. The sound of metal on metal filled the bakery. I didn't help him. I went back to kneading the dough for the morning rush. I needed to see if he could handle the nobody life he had been so quick to judge. As the sun began to rise, the bakery filled with the scent of fresh bread. My regular customers started trickling in, hardworking people who didn't know I was a billionaire. They just knew me as Witney, the woman who made the best sourdough in the city. One of the customers was a man named David, a local contractor who had helped me fix the roof when I was broke. He saw Julian at the sink and frowned. "New hire, Witney. He looks a bit soft for the job." "He's in training, David," I replied, "learning the basics." Julian's face was bright red. He kept his head down, the shame radiating off him. But he didn't stop. By the time the morning rush was over, his hands were pruned and his back was aching. He looked exhausted, but for the first time in years, he didn't look like a statue. He looked like a person. Just as I was about to give him a break, the bell over the door chimed. I didn't even have to look up to know the energy in the room had changed. The air felt cold, expensive, and poisonous. I looked up to see Mr. Vance, Clara's father. He wasn't in his suit. He looked disheveled. "Where is he?" Mr. Vance demanded, his voice a shrill whistle. "Where is that pathetic boy who ruined my daughter's life?" He spotted Julian at the sink and let out a bark of laughter. Oh, how fitting, from the boardroom to the scullery. I told Clara he was a mistake. Mr. Vance marched toward the counter, his expensive shoes clicking like a countdown timer. He ignored me completely, his eyes fixed on Julian. "Get your things, Julian. Clara is in a state, and I'm facing a jail cell because of your mother's little stunt. You're going to come with me. Sign a confession saying you were the one who embezzled the sterling funds, and in exchange, I'll give you a small apartment in the suburbs. It's more than you deserve." Julian stopped scrubbing. He looked at Mr. Vance, his eyes wide with fear. The power of money was still a very real ghost to him. He looked at me pleadingly. "He's not going anywhere, Arthur," I said, using his first name to remind him he had no status here. "And as for you, you aren't facing jail because of a stunt. You're facing jail because you spent 30 years stealing from a trust that didn't belong to him. You're lucky I don't sue you for the shirt on your back." Mr. Vance turned his venomous gaze on me. "You think you've won, don't you? You think a few papers and a bank account make you one of us. You're still just a dirty orphan who smells like yeast. You've destroyed the Vance name, but we have friends in high places. By the time I'm done, the sterling heir will be the most hated woman in the state." "I've been hated by better people than you, Arthur," I said calmly, "and I don't want to be one of you. I like being a person who can sleep at night. Now, get out of my shop before I call the health inspector to report a pest." Mr. Vance's face contorted. He reached across the counter to slap me, but Julian moved faster than I'd seen him move in years. He stepped between us, his wet hand catching Vance's wrist. "Don't touch her," he said, his voice low and steady, "and don't ever come back here. I'm not signing your confession. I'm not your puppet anymore." Mr. Vance looked at him with pure disgust. "You're a fool. You're choosing a sink over a life. Enjoy the grease, Julian. It's all you'll ever have." He wrenched his arm away and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Julian stood there for a moment, breathing hard. He looked at his hands, then at me. I actually meant it, Mom. "I know you did, Julian," I said. "But words are easy. Keeping the brush in your hand when the world gets cold is the hard part. Now, we have a delivery to make. Grab the crates." We spent the afternoon delivering bread to the local shelter. Julian was quiet, watching the people who had nothing but gratitude for a simple loaf of bread. But as we were driving back, my phone rang. It was the security team at the Sterling Trust. "Ms. Witney, you need to get to the main vault. Someone has bypassed the biometrics. Someone who has your son's finger." My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. I looked at Julian, who was sitting in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't left my side all day. "Julian, When did you last go to the Sterling Trust offices? The ones Clara's father used to manage. Julian looked confused. I haven't been there in weeks, Mom. Why? Someone is in the vault, I said, my voice tight. And they used your fingerprints to get in. Fingerprints that were supposedly recorded for emergency access. When you were still an executive, Julian's face went white. Clara, she has my biometric data. We had a smart home system that synced our fingerprints. She must have copied the digital signature before the accounts were frozen. I didn't waste another second. I slammed the car into gear and headed for the Sterling building. Clara wasn't just jealous of my relationship with Julian. She was obsessed with the power that money provided. If she couldn't own Julian, she was going to steal the legacy that made him useless to her. She wanted the Sterling jewels, a collection of ancient stones that were worth enough to buy a small country. They were the one thing that couldn't be frozen by a bank. We arrived at the building to find the lobby in chaos. The security guards were confused because the system showed the owner's son had entered legally. We bypassed the crowd and headed for the sub-basement. As the elevator descended, I felt a familiar weight in my pocket, the heavy, old-fashioned key Silas had given me. The legacy key. The vault doors were standing open. Inside, the lights were bright, reflecting off the cold steel. Standing in the center of the room was Clara. She was no longer wearing her designer clothes. She was in a dark jumpsuit, and she was stuffing velvet boxes into a backpack. Clara, stop, Julian shouted, stepping into the room. Clara spun around, a wild, jagged look in her eyes. Julian, what are you doing here? You should be scrubbing pans with your pathetic mother. She laughed, a sound that bordered on insanity. I'm taking what's mine. I spent 6 months married to you, dealing with your middle-class sensibilities. I earned these stones. You didn't earn anything, Clara, I said, stepping forward. You stole a man's heart and tried to burn his family. Now you're trying to steal a history that doesn't belong to you. Clara pulled a small, sleek device from her pocket. Don't move, Witney. This is a signal jammer. If I press this button, the vault doors seal and the oxygen scrubbers turn off. I'll be out the service entrance before you can even catch your breath. Give me the legacy key, or you both die in this box. Julian took a step toward her, his face determined. Clara, don't do this. It's just money. It's just rocks. It's power, Clara shrieked. And I'll never be a nobody. She pressed the button. The heavy steel doors of the vault began to groan, swinging shut with a finality that made the air feel instantly thinner. The hiss of the ventilation system died out, replaced by an eerie, ringing silence. Clara smirked, her hand still hovering over the jammer. You have 30 minutes of air in here, maybe less with the two of you breathing so hard. Give me the key, Witney, and I'll unlock the manual override from the outside. I looked at the closing gap of the door. I could have made a run for it, but I wouldn't leave Julian. And I wouldn't let Clara walk away with the Sterling jewels. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. "You want this, Clara? You want the power to open every door in this empire? Throw it to me," she demanded, her eyes wide with greed. I looked at the key, then at the backpack full of stolen history. "This key doesn't just open doors, Clara. It reveals truths. You think money is power. I'll show you what real power looks like." I threw the key not to Clara, but into the deep, dark drainage grate in the corner of the vault floor. "No," Clara screamed, lunging for the grate. While she was distracted, Julian moved. He didn't hesitate. He tackled Clara, pinning her to the floor. The backpack spilled open, diamonds and emeralds cascading across the cold floor like frozen tears. The signal jammer skittered across the room, landing near my feet. I picked it up and pressed the override. The vault doors halted their closing arc and slowly began to grind open. Clara was sobbing now, a pathetic, broken sound. "You ruined everything. I was going to be someone. I was going to be the queen of the city." "You were never a queen, Clara," I said, standing over her. "You were just a little girl who was afraid of being ordinary, and because of that fear, you've lost the only person who actually would have loved you for being ordinary." Julian stood up, his face pale. He looked at the woman he had once thought was his future. "I'm calling the police, Clara, not for the money, for the fact that you were willing to let my mother suffocate for it." The police arrived minutes later. As they led Clara away in handcuffs, she didn't look back at Julian. She was staring at the floor, still trying to grab a loose diamond with her cute toe. The jealousy and the greed had stripped away every shred of her humanity. Julian and I walked out of the building into the night air. He was quiet for a long time. "Mom, what was that key? The one you threw down the drain?" I pulled the real brass key out of my other pocket and showed it to him. That was just an old key to the bakery's flower closet. The real power, Julian, is knowing when to let go of the things that don't matter. The next few weeks were a blur of legal battles and reconstruction. Clara was facing 20 years for attempted murder and grand larceny. Mr. Vance was already in prison, and Mrs. Vance had fled the country to avoid being named as an accomplice. The Vance empire was gone, replaced by the Sterling Trust. I was officially the wealthiest woman in the city, but my life hadn't changed much. I still woke up at 4 a.m. to bake bread. Julian was still working at the bakery. He had graduated from scrubbing pans to kneading dough. He was good at it. He had a rhythmic, focused way of working that reminded me of my own mother. He didn't ask about the sterling money. He didn't ask for a new car or a fancy apartment. He lived in the small spare room above the bakery, and he seemed content. One evening, as we were closing up, a young woman walked in. She looked tired, her clothes worn but clean. She was carrying a small baby in a faded sling. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I heard you give away the leftover bread at the end of the day. I just lost my job." I looked at her, and for a second, I saw myself 30 years ago. I saw the orphan who had nothing but a hope for her child. I handed her a large bag of fresh rolls and a loaf of sourdough. "Take this, dear, and come back tomorrow morning. I need someone to help with the front counter. It pays well, and you can keep the baby with you." The woman's eyes filled with tears. You'd do that for a stranger." "No one is a stranger in this shop," I said. After she left, Julian looked at me. "You're going to use the sterling money to help people like her, aren't you? Not just with bread, but with everything." "That's the plan, Julian. Money is only power if you use it to lift people up. If you use it to hold them down, it's just a weight that eventually pulls you under." Julian nodded, then hesitated. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you. I found something in Clara's old desk when I was packing up the last of the penthouse items. It's a letter from your mother." My heart stopped. "My mother, Sela, said she died years ago." "The letter says she didn't die, Mom," Julian whispered, pulling a yellowed envelope from his pocket. "It says she was hidden away in a private sanitarium by the Vances 30 years ago. They didn't just steal the trust, Witney. They stole her." The bakery went silent, the only sound being the hum of the cooling ovens. I took the envelope from Julian's hand, my fingers trembling. The paper felt brittle, like a secret that had been kept in the dark for too long. I pulled out the letter. The handwriting was elegant, but shaky. The ink faded to a pale brown. "To my dearest Witney," it began. "If you are reading this, it means the darkness has finally been lifted. I never left you because I wanted to. I was told you had died in the fire at the nursery. I was heartbroken and vulnerable, and that is when they took me. The Vances. They wanted the sterling signatures. They have kept me in a golden cage, telling the world I am mad so they could rule in my name. Find me, Witney. I am at the Willow Creek estate. I am waiting for the daughter I thought I lost." I felt a roar of anger in my chest that eclipsed everything I had felt toward Clara or Julian. This wasn't just jealousy or greed. This was a crime against the human soul. They had allowed me to grow up an orphan, thinking I was unloved, while they kept my mother prisoner just to sign checks. The power of money had been used to commit a slow-motion murder of 30 years. "Mom, are you okay?" Julian asked, reaching out to steady me. "Get the car," I said, my voice sounding like it came from a deep, cold well. "We're going to Willow Creek. Now." "Mom, it's 4 hours away, and it's a high-security facility. We should call the police." "No," I snapped. "The police didn't find her for 30 years because they were being paid not to look. We are going as the sterling heirs. We're going to use the very thing they used to hide her to get her back." We drove through the night, the city lights fading into the dark, rolling hills of the countryside. Willow Creek was a massive, ivy-covered mansion surrounded by iron gates and armed guards. It looked more like a fortress than a hospital. As we pulled up to the gate, a guard stepped out, his hand on his holster. "Private property," he barked. "No visitors without an appointment." I rolled down the window and held up the leather folder Sela's had given me, the one with the sterling seal. I am Witney Sterling. I am the owner of this estate, the land it sits on, and the company that pays your salary. Open the gate, or you'll be looking for a new job in 5 minutes. The guard looked at the seal, then at my face. He didn't argue. He hit the button, and the gates swung open with a heavy, mournful creak. We drove up the long, winding driveway. The house loomed over us, its windows dark and unwelcoming. But in a single room on the 3rd floor, a candle was flickering. Someone was awake. I didn't wait for the front door to be opened. I used the legacy key, the real one, and pushed through the heavy oak doors. The foyer was filled with the smell of old roses and dust. A woman in a nurse's uniform came running down the stairs, looking panicked. You can't be here. This is a restricted area. I am the restriction, I said, walking past her. I felt an invisible thread pulling me toward the stairs. I climbed them with a strength I didn't know I had, my heart thumping against my ribs. Julian was right behind me, his face set in a grim line of determination. We reached the 3rd floor. The hallway was long and silent, lined with locked doors. I stopped at the very end, in front of the room where I had seen the candle. My hand hovered over the knob. I was 50 years old, but in that moment, I felt like the 3-year-old girl who used to cry for her mother in the dark. I turned the knob. The room was small, but filled with books and paintings. Sitting in a chair by the window was a woman. Her hair was as white as snow, and her face was a map of every tear she had ever shed. She turned her head, and for a second, time stood still. She had my eyes. She had my chin. "Witney," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. I couldn't speak. I sank to my knees at her feet and took her hands. They were thin and cold, but they felt like home. "I'm here, Mother. I'm so sorry it took so long." She pulled me into an embrace, and 30 years of loneliness dissolved in a single breath. "They told me you were gone," she sobbed. "They told me I was alone. The people who lied to you are gone now," I said, pulling back to look at her. "They're in cells, and their world has burned to the ground. You're coming home." Suddenly, the door behind us slammed open. A man stood there, tall and imposing, wearing a white doctor's coat, but his eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of a Vance. "I'm afraid she's not going anywhere, Miss Sterling. This woman is legally incompetent. Her care is under my jurisdiction by order of the Vance estate." "The Vance estate no longer exists," Julian said, stepping forward. "I should know. I was the heir to it, and I'm telling you to step aside." The doctor sneered, pulling a needle from his pocket. "I don't think you understand the power of a signed medical order. If I say she's a danger to herself, she stays. And if you interfere, I'll have you committed too." The doctor took a step toward my mother, the needle glinting in the candlelight. He thought he could still intimidate us with orders and jurisdiction. He didn't realize that the world he lived in had been demolished while he was sleeping. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, doctor," I said, my voice low and dangerous. I didn't move from my mother's side. I've spent the last month dismantling the Vance empire brick by brick. Do you really think I didn't check the payroll of this sanitarium? The doctor hesitated, his thumb hovering over the plunger. My salary is paid by a private trust. A private trust that I seized yesterday, I replied. You're not a doctor anymore. You're a kidnapper on my payroll. And I just fired you, along with every guard and nurse in this building. I pulled out my phone and hit a button. Outside, the night was suddenly filled with the roar of sirens and the flash of blue lights. I hadn't come here alone. I had come with a team of federal investigators and a new medical team I had hired from the city's top hospital. Julian, get Mother's things, I commanded. The doctor's face shifted from arrogance to pure terror. He dropped the needle and tried to bolt for the door, but the police were already there. They tackled him to the floor, the handcuffs clicking shut, a sound that was becoming the theme song of my new life. I turned back to my mother. She was looking at the chaos with wide, wondering eyes. Is it over, Witney? Is the cage really open? It's open, Mother, and it's never closing again. We walked out of that house, my mother leaning on my arm and Julian's. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the sun began to peek over the horizon, turning the dark ivy of Willow Creek into a vibrant, living green. The power of money had built this prison, but the power of truth had torn it down. We brought my mother back to the city. I didn't take her to a penthouse or a mansion. I brought her to the small apartment above the bakery. I wanted her to see the life I had built with my own hands before she saw the empire I had inherited. She spent her first day of freedom sitting by the window, watching the people on the street. But as evening fell, a familiar car pulled up to the curb. It was Clara's mother, Beatrice, and she didn't look like she was running anymore. She looked like she was hunting. Beatrice Vance didn't wait for an invitation. She hammered on the bakery door until I opened it. She was disheveled, her fur coat stained, and her eyes wild with a mixture of desperation and fury. You think you've won, Witney. You think bringing back that old ghost is the end of it, she spat, pointing a trembling finger at the window where my mother sat. It's the end for you, Beatrice, I said, standing in the doorway. The police are looking for you. You should be halfway to the border by now. I have something you want, Witney. Something even the Sterling Trust can't buy. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, encrypted hard drive. This contains the locations of the overseas accounts Clara's father set up using your mother's identity. $50 million. It's offshore, untraceable, and unreachable by your legal teams. Give me $10 million in cash, a plane ticket, and my daughter's freedom, and I'll give you the drive. Otherwise, I'll wipe it, and your family legacy will stay in the pockets of Swiss bankers forever. I looked at the drive. $50 million was a staggering amount of money, even for the Sterling heir. But I also looked at Beatrice. She was the woman who had helped hide my mother for 30 years. She was the one who had encouraged Clara's jealousy and greed. She was a poison that wouldn't stop until it was completely neutralized. "You're offering me money to buy a murderer's freedom?" I asked. "You really don't know me at all, do you?" "I know your mother," Beatrice hissed, "and Clara is my daughter. I will do anything to get her out of that cage." "Then you should have taught her not to build cages for others," I said. I didn't reach for the drive. Instead, I stepped back and let someone else step into the light. My mother walked to the door. She looked frail, but her presence was like a mountain. She looked at Beatrice, the woman who had visited her once a year just to gloat. "Beatrice," she said softly, "you always were so small. Even with all that money, you were always so small." Beatrice's face crumpled. The power of money had finally failed her. She realized that we didn't want the offshore accounts. We didn't want more gold. We wanted justice. "The police are around the corner, Beatrice," my mother continued. "You can give them the drive, or you can throw it in the river. It doesn't matter. We are already rich. We have each other." Beatrice let out a scream of rage and lunged at my mother, her hands clawed like talons. But she didn't realize that Julian was standing just behind the counter. Julian caught Beatrice before she could touch my mother. He didn't use violence. He simply held her arms with the strength of a man who had spent weeks working hard, honest hours. Beatrice struggled and cursed, her expensive jewelry clattering against the floor, but she was powerless. The power of money was gone, and she was just a bitter woman in a stained coat. "Let go of me, you traitor," she shrieked. "I gave you everything. I made you a Vance." "No," Julian said, his voice calm and firm. "You made me a shadow. My mother made me a man. And now, I'm making sure you never hurt anyone again." The police arrived moments later, the sirens a familiar chorus now. They took the hard drive and led Beatrice away. She didn't go quietly. She screamed Clara's name until the doors of the police cruiser slammed shut. The Vance family was finally, officially, erased from the city's power structure. We went back inside. My mother sat down at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. She looked at Julian, then at me. "He's a good man, Witney. You did well. You raised him to be better than the world he was born into." "I almost lost him, Mother," I admitted, sitting beside her. "I almost let the money win, but you didn't," she said, squeezing my hand. And that is the true sterling legacy. Not the banks, not the jewels. The courage to choose what is right when what is easy is so tempting. The next few months were a time of healing. My mother slowly regained her strength, her laughter returning to the bakery. Julian became a partner in the business, and together we turned the Sterling Trust into a foundation that funded orphanages, schools, and bakeries for people who had nothing. Clara remained in prison. She refused to see Julian, and she refused to see me. She was still trapped in her own jealousy, unable to understand how someone could be happy without a penthouse and a title. She had everything she ever wanted: solitude and the memory of her own importance. 1 year later, on the anniversary of my mother's rescue, we held a small party in the bakery. The woman with the baby, the one I had hired, was now our manager. David, the contractor, was there. Silas was there, looking slightly less like parchment. I looked around at my family, the blood family I had found, and the chosen family I had built. I realized that the power of money is like a mirror. If you are a good person, it reflects beauty. If you are a bad person, it reflects your own ugliness. A toast, my mother said, raising her glass. To Witney, the girl who was never a nobody. The celebration was at its height when a man I didn't recognize walked through the door. He was dressed in a suit that looked slightly dated, but he carried himself with an air of quiet authority. He didn't look like a Vance, and he didn't look like a Sterling. He looked like a man who had traveled a long distance. "May I help you?" Julian asked, stepping forward. He was always protective now, a sentinel for the peace we had built. The man looked at me, then at my mother. His eyes softened. "I'm not here for the bread, though it smells wonderful. I'm here because I heard the Sterling heir had finally come home. My name is Thomas. I was your mother's protector before the Vances took her." My mother stood up, her hand flying to her throat. "Thomas," I thought. "They told me you were killed in the fire." "They told everyone a lot of things, Rose," Thomas said, stepping into the room. "I've spent 30 years in hiding, waiting for a sign that it was safe to return. When I saw the news about the trust being reclaimed, I knew the time had come." He pulled a small, weathered notebook from his pocket. "I have the rest of the story, the part the Vances didn't even know. The part that explains why they were so afraid of you, Witney." I took the notebook. It was a ledger, but it wasn't about money. It was about a piece of land, a small, rocky island off the coast that had been in the Sterling family for a century. The Vances had spent millions trying to buy it, but they could never find the deed. "What's on the island, Thomas?" I asked. "It's not what's on it, Witney. It's what's under it. The city's main water source runs through a massive aquifer beneath that land. Whoever owns that island owns the lifeblood of this entire region. The Vances wanted it so they could privatize the water and charge people for the right to drink. They didn't just want your money. They wanted to own the very air and water." I looked at the ledger, then at my mother. The jealousy and greed were even deeper than I thought. They hadn't just stolen a family. They had been planning to steal the future of the entire city. "Where is the deed, Thomas?" "It's not a paper, Witney," Thomas said, looking at the silver locket around my neck, the one I had worn since I was a child. "It's inside that." I reached up and touched the locket. It was a simple, tarnished piece of silver I had found in my belongings at the orphanage. I had always assumed it was a cheap trinket, the only thing my poor parents could afford. I hadn't taken it off in 30 years. "Open it, Witney," my mother whispered. I put it there the night of the fire. I knew if they found me, they would take everything. I hoped they would think the locket was worthless. I fumbled with the clasp. It was rusted shut, fused by time and the salt of 1,000 tears. Julian handed me a small tool from the bakery kit. With a gentle pry, the locket snapped open. Inside, there was no photo. Instead, there was a tiny, microscopic film strip and a miniature key made of a strange, dark metal. That key opens a safe deposit box in the old maritime lighthouse, Thomas explained. Inside that box is the original grant from the state. As long as a sterling holds that deed, the water remains public and free. If it falls into the wrong hands, the city will be bled dry. But the Vances are in jail, I said. Who else could be looking for it? The Vances were just the front, Witney, Thomas said, his face darkening. They were backed by a global conglomerate called Vanguard Prime. They don't care about names or families. They only care about resources. And they've already realized that Clara and her parents failed. They'll be coming for you next. Just as he spoke, the windows of the bakery shattered. A black SUV had pulled up, and men in tactical gear were jumping out. They weren't police. They didn't have sirens. They were silent, professional, and deadly. Get to the back, Julian shouted, pushing my mother and the manager toward the kitchen. I gripped the tiny dark key in my hand. The power of money had turned into something even more dangerous. The power of corporations. They didn't want to buy me. They wanted to eliminate me. The locket. One of the men barked as he burst through the door. Give us the locket, and no one has to die. I looked at Julian, who had grabbed a heavy rolling pin. We were bakers against soldiers, but we were fighting on our own turf. The lead man lunged toward me, his hand reaching for the silver chain around my neck. I didn't wait. I ducked behind the heavy marble pastry table, the one I had bought with my first real savings. Julian swung the rolling pin with a roar, catching the man in the ribs. It wasn't a tactical move, but it was effective. The man went down, gasping for air. The back door. Go, Julian yelled. We scrambled into the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of scorched flour and ozone. The men were right behind us, their heavy boots thumping on the linoleum. Thomas led the way, surprisingly agile for his age. He pushed open the heavy steel door of the walk-in freezer. In here, it's reinforced. We'll be trapped. I cried, trust me. Thomas urged. We piled into the freezer, the cold hitting us like a wall. Thomas slammed the door and turned a hidden latch I hadn't even known existed. This freezer was built by your grandfather, Witney. He knew the Sterling family would always have enemies. There's a service tunnel behind the cooling units. He shoved aside a stack of crates, revealing a small, dark crawlspace. One by one, we climbed inside, my mother, Julian, the manager with her baby, and finally me. We crawled through the damp, narrow tunnel as the sound of the freezer door being battered echoed behind us. We emerged 10 minutes later in the basement of the old warehouse across the street. We were shivering, covered in dust, but we were alive. "We have to get to the lighthouse," Thomas said, his breath hitching. "If Vanguard Prime gets there first, they'll destroy the deed and claim the land through a missing owner clause." "But they're watching the roads," Julian said. "We can't use the car." "We don't need a car," I said, looking at the river that ran behind the warehouse. "We need a boat, and I know exactly who owns the marina." I pulled out my phone and called David, the contractor. He wasn't just a builder. He was a former Coast Guard captain. "David, it's Witney. I need a favor, a big one. And it needs to be fast." The river was a dark, churning ribbon under the moonlight. David was waiting for us at a secluded dock, his old but sturdy patrol boat idling quietly. He didn't ask questions. He saw our dusty clothes and my mother's pale face, and simply gestured for us to get on board. "The lighthouse is 10 miles downstream," David said, his hand steady on the throttle. "Vanguard Prime has a helicopter in the air. We'll have to stay close to the banks to avoid their thermal sensors." We huddled in the small cabin, the sound of the engine a comforting thrum. I held the tiny dark key in my palm. It felt cold, almost vibrating with the weight of the responsibility it carried. My mother was resting her head on my shoulder, her eyes closed. "I spent 30 years thinking I was a victim," she whispered, "but I realize now I was a guardian. I kept the secret by staying alive. And now it's your turn, Witney." "I'm scared, Mother," I admitted. "I was just a baker. I don't know how to fight a global company." "You already fought a family that tried to erase you," Julian said, sitting across from us. "A company is just a group of people who think money makes them gods. But they bleed just like Clara did." Suddenly, a bright searchlight swept across the water, illuminating the boat for a split second. A loud, rhythmic thumping filled the air. The helicopter was above us. "They found us," David shouted. "Hold on." He jammed the throttle forward, and the boat leaped through the water. Bullets began to spray the surface of the river, kicking up plumes of white spray. David steered into a narrow, tree-lined inlet, the branches scraping against the hull. The helicopter hovered above, unable to follow us into the tight space. "The lighthouse is just around the bend," David yelled over the noise. "I'll drop you at the old stone pier. I'll draw them away." "David, no, they'll kill you." "I'm a ghost on this river, Witney. Just get that deed." He skidded the boat against the pier, and we jumped out into the tall grass. David immediately reversed, his engine roaring as he headed back into the main channel. I looked up at the lighthouse. It was a crumbling tower of stone, standing like a lonely sentinel against the sea. We sprinted up the winding stone path to the lighthouse. The wind was howling now, carrying the scent of salt and ancient secrets. The helicopter was circling back, its light scanning the cliffs like a hungry eye. We reached the heavy iron door of the tower. I fumbled with the tiny dark key, my hands shaking in the cold. "Hurry, Witney," Julian urged, looking at the approaching light. The key slid into a hidden slot beneath the rusted handle. There was a soft click, and the door groaned open. We burst inside, the air smelling of oil and old ocean. Thomas led the way up the spiral staircase, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. At the very top, in the lantern room, sat a small iron box bolted to the floor. I knelt beside it and inserted the key. The lid flipped open, revealing a thick, wax-sealed parchment and a flash drive. The deed, I breathed, touching the paper, and the evidence of Vanguard's illegal land grab attempts. "Give it to me, Witney." The voice didn't come from Julian or Thomas. It came from the shadows behind the giant lens of the lighthouse. A man stepped out, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that looked absurd in the dusty room. He was holding a silenced pistol. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas whispered, his voice full of shock. I looked at the man. He was older, with a face that looked remarkably like mine. You're my father's brother," I realized. "The one who disappeared before the fire." "I didn't disappear, Witney. I joined the winning side," my Uncle Julian said, his voice smooth and cold. "The Vances were my puppets. They were supposed to keep your mother quiet while I finalized the deal with Vanguard. But they got greedy, they got jealous, and they failed." He stepped closer, the gun pointed at my heart. "I don't want to kill my own niece, but I will not let a baker destroy a billion-dollar merger. Hand over the box, and I'll make sure you and your son have a comfortable life in Europe. A very, very quiet life." I looked at the man who shared my blood, but not my soul. "You'd sell the city's water for a merger?" I asked. "You'd let people die of thirst for a bank account?" "People always find a way to pay," he replied. "Now the box." I looked at the iron box, then at my uncle. The jealousy that had consumed the Vances was nothing compared to the cold, calculated greed of this man. He didn't care about family. He didn't even care about revenge. He only cared about the leverage that owning a city's lifeblood would give him. "You think this deed is your ticket to power?" I said, standing up and holding the parchment tight. "It's not. It's a death warrant for your soul." "I'll take that risk," he sneered, taking another step forward. "The helicopter will be here in 2 minutes. If I have that box, the deal goes through. If I don't, I'll just burn this tower down with all of you inside." Julian started to move, but my uncle shifted the gun toward him. "Don't, Julian. I'd hate to make your mother mourn twice." Suddenly, my mother stepped forward. She was trembling, but her eyes were like burning embers. "You always were a coward, Uncle Julian. You hid behind the Vances while I sat in that cage. You didn't even have the courage to face me for 30 years. Uncle Julian's face twitched. "I did what was necessary for the Sterling name." "You dragged the Sterling name through the mud," she shouted. While they were talking, I noticed the heavy chain that controlled the lighthouse's rotating lens. It was old and rusted, but it was positioned right above Julian's head. I looked at Thomas, who was standing near the manual crank. He caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. I'm not giving you the box, Uncle Julian, I said, my voice steady. But I will give you a lesson in physics. Now, I screamed. Thomas wrenched the manual crank, releasing the lock on the massive glass lens. The ton of crystal and metal swung forward with a thunderous roar. Julian looked up, his eyes widening in terror, but he was too slow. The lens caught him, pinning him against the stone wall. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding through a gap in the floorboards. The lighthouse shook as the helicopter hovered just outside the glass, its light blinding us. A voice boomed over the loudspeaker. "This is the police. Drop your weapons and move away from the box." The police weren't Vanguard Prime's men. They were the real authorities, led by Silas and a team of federal agents who had been tracking Vanguard's illegal activities for months. As they rappelled down into the lantern room, Uncle Julian lay trapped behind the lens, his power gone, his suit torn, and his eyes filled with the realization that he was headed to a cell even smaller than the one he had put my mother in. They took the iron box and the flash drive. They took Julian in handcuffs, and they took us back to the city, not as fugitives, but as heroes. The next day, the news was a tidal wave. Vanguard Prime dissolved after fraud exposure. Sterling heir saves city's water. The secret history of the lighthouse deed. The power of money had tried to own the very essence of life, but it had been defeated by a family that knew the value of a single loaf of bread. I sat in the bakery with my mother and Julian. The shop was closed, the Sterling Foundation sign being installed above the door. We were now the most powerful family in the state, but we were still sitting at a wooden table, drinking tea. "What happens now, Mom?" Julian asked. "Now we make it official," I said. "The deed is being signed over to a public land trust. The Sterling family will be the permanent guardians, but the water belongs to the people. Forever." "And the money?" my mother asked. "The money is going to fix the schools, the parks, and the hospitals that Vanguard and the Vances ignored for 30 years. We're going to turn gold into hope." There was a knock on the door. I expected a reporter or a lawyer, but when I opened it, I found Clara. She was wearing a prison jumpsuit under a heavy coat, guarded by 2 officers. She had been granted a 1-hour compassionate leave to see her mother, who was in the hospital ward. She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see jealousy or greed. I saw a profound, hollow emptiness. "I heard what you did," she whispered. "You could have owned everything. Why did you give it away?" "Because I already have everything, Clara," I said, looking back at my son and my mother. "I have a family that loves me for being a nobody. And that's a wealth you'll never understand." Clara stood there for a long time, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked at the bakery, at the warmth and the light, and then back at the dark van waiting to take her back to her cell. She didn't say another word. She just turned and walked away, a ghost of a life that could have been. The following weeks were filled with a different kind of work. We weren't fighting for our lives anymore. We were building them. The Rose Center was opened, a massive complex that provided housing and job training for orphans and single mothers. Julian ran the vocational program, teaching people that a trade was a treasure no one could steal. My mother became the honorary chair of the foundation. She spent her days in the gardens of the Sterling estate, which we had turned into a public park. She was no longer a prisoner of a golden cage. She was the queen of a green paradise. One afternoon, Silas came to visit. He looked younger, the weight of the Sterling secrets finally off his shoulders. "Witney, there's one last thing. The offshore accounts Beatrice mentioned. We found them." "I don't want them, Silas," I said. "Give them to the city. You don't understand." The accounts weren't just money. They were filled with stolen artifacts and artworks that had been missing since the war, pieces of history that belonged to museums all over the world. "Then return them," I said. "Every single one. It will cost millions in legal fees and shipping," Silas warned. "Good. That's a much better use of millions than a private jet or a penthouse." As Silas left, I felt a sense of completion. The power of money had been a storm that tried to drown us, but we had used it to water a garden. The jealousy that had fueled Clara and the Vances was a distant memory, a shadow that had been chased away by the sun. But as I was locking up the bakery that night, I saw a familiar face across the street. A man I hadn't seen in years, a man who had been my only friend in the orphanage. "Witney," he called out, his voice hesitant. "Is it really you? Is it true what they're saying on the news?" I looked at him, and for a second, I was 3 years old again. "It's me, Sam, and it's all true. But I'm still just the girl who shared her cookies with you." Sam walked across the street, his face a map of a hard life. He was a laborer, his hands calloused and his clothes dusty. He looked at the Sterling Foundation sign, then at my face. "I always knew you were special, Witney. Even when we were kids. You always looked after the ones who were smaller than you." "I learned it from you, Sam," I said, pulling him into a hug. "You were the one who taught me that a friend is worth more than a fortune." We spent the evening talking, sharing stories of the years we had spent apart. Sam had struggled, moving from city to city, never quite finding his place. He was an orphan who was still looking for a home. "I have a place for you, Sam," I said. "At the Rose Center. We need someone who knows what it's like to be at the bottom, to help lead the people at the top. We need a nobody to keep us honest." Sam's eyes filled with tears. "You'd do that for me? After all this time?" "Family isn't just about blood, Sam. It's about the people who remember you when everyone else forgets." As I walked Sam to the guest room above the bakery, I looked out at the city. The lights were twinkling, a vast sea of human lives. I thought about the Vances, about Julian, and about Clara. They had all been so afraid of being nobody that they had become nothing. They had chased a power that left them powerless. I went to my mother's room. She was asleep, a peaceful smile on her face. I went to Julian's room. He was reading a book on sustainable agriculture, planning for the next community garden. I went to my own room and looked in the mirror. I didn't see an orphan. I didn't see an heir. I saw Witney, a woman who had survived a golden cage and found a diamond heart. The next morning, the Sterling Foundation was officially inaugurated. Thousands of people gathered in the park to celebrate, but as I stood on the stage, ready to give my speech, I saw a small, poorly dressed man pushing his way through the crowd toward the podium. "Wait," he shouted. "There's one more secret. There's one more Sterling." The crowd went silent as the man reached the stage. He was clutching a ragged bundle of papers. He looked at me, his eyes wide, with a strange kind of desperation. "I was the janitor at the sanitarium where your mother was kept, Witney. I found these in the trash after the Vances left. I took the papers. They were records of a second child, a twin, a brother I never knew I had. He had been sent to a different orphanage in a different country to ensure that the Sterling line could never be fully reunited." I looked at the name on the paper, Julian. I turned to my son, who was standing right behind me. He looked at the paper, then at me. His face went white. "Mom, the orphanage I was in before you adopted me, that's the same name. That's the same city." The power of money had committed one final, twisted act of cruelty. They hadn't just stolen my life. They had sold my brother's child to me as an orphan, making me raise my own nephew without ever knowing he was my blood. The jealousy and the greed had created a web so complex it had turned a family into a riddle. I looked at Julian, my son, my nephew, my partner. The labels didn't matter. The blood didn't change the 20 years of love and struggle we had shared. "It doesn't change anything, Julian," I said, my voice echoing through the park. "You were always my son, and now you're the full heir to everything we've built. The Sterling line isn't just reunited, it's finally, truly family." The crowd erupted in cheers. The power of money had tried to divide us, but it had only made our bond unbreakable. We had turned a legacy of betrayal into a future of belonging. The moral of the story: wealth is not measured by the size of your bank account, but by the strength of the hearts you hold dear. Money can build a palace, but only love can make it a home. Never be afraid to be a nobody, for it is in the quiet, honest moments that we find our true power. Jealousy is a fire that consumes the vessel, but kindness is a light that illuminates the world. Clara and the Vances thought they were the masters of the world, but they were only prisoners of their own greed. Witney, the orphan, was the one who was truly free. And in the end, that is the only inheritance that matters. We walked off the stage, hand in hand, ready to start the next chapter, not as heirs,